Get ready for this. One medieval queen had her husband's murderers scalded to death, then buried another group alive, and even tricked a whole town into a fiery trap using birds. Another queen, fed up with her king, raised an army with her lover to invade her own country and snatch the crown. And can you believe a queen was locked up by her own royal husband for a whopping 16 years, only to come back fiercer than ever? These aren't fairy tales. These are the real lives of medieval queens who ripped up the royal rule book. Number 9. Blanche of Castile, the queen who ruled France with an iron fist, while technically not wearing the crown. Imagine being a queen from a foreign land, your husband the king dies, and you're left with a young son who's supposed to rule one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Sounds like a recipe for disaster, right? Especially in the 1200s, when men usually called all the shots. But Blanche of Castile wasn't just any queen. She was a force of nature. When her husband, King Louis VIII of France, died in 1226, their son Louis IX was only 12. Most nobles at the time probably thought, "Sweet, now we can do whatever we want." They were so wrong. Blanche stepped up as regent, basically the boss, until her son was old enough. And boy, did she boss. The French barons, those big important lords who were used to having their way, immediately started plotting. They didn't like a Spanish woman telling them what to do. They formed alliances, threatened war, and generally tried to push her out. Did Blanche crumble? Not a chance. She was smart, tough, and knew how to play the political game. One of her biggest headaches was a group of rebellious barons led by Philip Hirapal, who was actually King Louis VIII's illegitimate half-brother. Talk about fang. They thought they could easily outmaneuver a grieving widow. Instead, Blanche showed them what she was made of. She gathered loyal supporters, moved quickly with her forces, sometimes even with young Louis in tow to inspire loyalty, and faced them down. There's a story that during one tricky situation, when some nobles threatened to abandon her and young Louis, she basically shamed them into staying loyal by appealing to their honor and their duty to the young king. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, metaphorically speaking, and use every tool at her disposal: diplomacy, threats, and military pressure. She also had to deal with outside troublemakers like King Henry III of England, who saw France's boy king situation as a perfect opportunity to win back some land. Blanche outmaneuvered him too. She was deeply religious, a trait she passed on to her son, who later became St. Louis. But her piety didn't make her a pushover. She used her strong moral standing to her advantage, often framing her actions as being for the good of the kingdom and the young king's God-given rights. Blanche managed to crush several baronial revolts during her regency. She didn't just win. She made sure everyone knew who was in charge. She arranged strategic marriages, secured treaties, and kept the kingdom stable and strong. Even when Louis IX officially came of age in 1234, Blanche remained his most trusted advisor. She was so indispensable that when Louis went on crusade years later, guess who he left in charge as regent again? Yep, his mom. And again, she capably managed the kingdom, dealing with finances, justice, and more rebellions. She was a queen who showed everyone that a woman, and a foreign one at that, could rule as effectively, if not more so, than any king. She never officially wore the crown as ruler in her own right, but for many years, Blanche of Castile was the power in France. Number 8. Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf who fought tooth and nail for her son's crown. If you thought medieval queens were all about embroidery and waiting for their husbands to come home from war, then you haven't met Margaret of Anjou. This French princess married King Henry VI of England in 1445, and she probably expected a life of relative royal comfort. What she got was a front row seat to one of England's bloodiest civil wars, the Wars of the Roses. And she wasn't just a spectator. She became one of its fiercest, most determined players. Her husband, Henry VI, wasn't exactly a strong leader. He suffered from bouts of mental illness that left him completely incapable of ruling. Imagine trying to run a country when the king is, well, not really there. This power vacuum led to ambitious nobles, particularly Richard, Duke of York, trying to take control. Margaret wasn't about to let that happen, especially once her son, Edward of Westminster, was born. Suddenly, she wasn't just fighting for her husband, she was fighting for her child's inheritance, his right to be king. People at the time weren't used to queens getting so involved in politics, and heaven forbid warfare. Queens were supposed to be meek, pious, and supportive. Margaret was not that. When York started making moves for power, even getting himself named Protector of the Realm during one of Henry's episodes, Margaret pushed back hard. She became the leader of the Lancastrian faction, the side loyal to her husband and son. She gathered armies, made alliances, and was relentless. Her enemies painted her as a she-wolf, an unnatural, power-hungry woman. But what choice did she have if she wanted to protect her family's claim? Margaret was directly involved in military campaigns. She didn't just sit in a castle. She was out there rallying troops, making strategic decisions. After her side suffered a major defeat and her husband was captured, did she give up? No way. She fled to Scotland, then to France, tirelessly seeking support and raising new armies. She was a queen on a mission, and that mission was to put her son on the throne. She even at one point allowed her forces to plunder English towns after a victory, which definitely didn't win her any popularity contests, but showed her desperation and ruthlessness. There were brutal battles, betrayals, and moments when it seemed all was lost. At the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, her forces were decisively crushed, and her son, Prince Edward, was killed. This was the ultimate tragedy for Margaret. The son she had fought for so fiercely was gone. She herself was captured and imprisoned for several years, until she was ransomed by the King of France. Margaret of Anjou's story is a dramatic one. She was a queen who stepped so far out of the expected role for a medieval woman, let alone a queen consort. She took charge in a way that shocked many of her contemporaries. She may not have ultimately won the war, but she fought with a ferocity and determination that made her a legendary figure, a queen who refused to be a pawn and instead became a warrior for her cause. Number 7. Aethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, the warrior queen who built an English kingdom. Forget delicate princesses in towers. Let's talk about Aethelflaed. daughter of Alfred the Great. Yes, that Alfred, the one who supposedly burnt the cakes but also saved England from the Vikings. Aethelflaed wasn't technically a queen in the way we usually think of one, but she ruled a kingdom and kicked some serious Viking butt. She was known as the Lady of the Mercians, and in the early 900s, she was one of the most important figures in England. Aethelflaed was married to Aethelred, the Lord of Mercia, which was one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. When her husband became ill and eventually died, did she retire to a nunnery as many high-status widows did? Absolutely not. She took over. And Mercia wasn't some peaceful, quiet place. It was on the front line of the fight against the Danish Vikings, who had conquered large parts of England. What made Aethelflaed so extraordinary was her military leadership. This wasn't a woman directing things from afar. She was a strategist and a commander. She continued her father Alfred's policy of building fortified towns called burhs. These weren't just defensive. They were strategic launching points for offensive campaigns. She built them all across Mercia, places like Stafford, Warwick, and Tamworth. Think of it as a massive, kingdom-wide construction project with a military purpose, and it worked. These burhs helped secure Mercia and push back the Viking threat. She didn't just build forts, she led her troops. Chronicles from the time, though often brief, mention her military expeditions. In 917, she captured the Viking stronghold of Derby. That was a huge deal. Derby was one of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, a major Viking center. The next year, 918, she took Leicester. She was systematically reclaiming land from the Danes. There's even a Welsh chronicle that records her leading an army to capture a Welsh king's wife after the king had murdered an English abbot. So she wasn't just dealing with Vikings. What's even more amazing is that she coordinated her military efforts with her brother Edward, the Elder, who was King of Wessex. Together, they were a power duo, systematically expanding Anglo-Saxon control. It's like they had a grand plan to create a unified England. Some historians say that the Mercians, usually very proud and independent, accepted her rule so completely that they offered her full allegiance even though she was a woman. She commanded their respect and loyalty through her actions. When Aethelflaed died in 918 in Tamworth, it was said that she had governed Mercia with rightful lordship. Her death was a big blow. Her daughter, Elfwin, briefly succeeded her, but Edward of Wessex soon absorbed Mercia into his kingdom. Still, Aethelflaed's legacy was immense. She was a key architect of what would eventually become England, a female ruler in a man's world who led armies, built defenses, and governed a kingdom with skill and courage. She truly broke the mold for what a woman could achieve in the Anglo-Saxon era. Number 6. Urraca of Leon and Castile, the queen who ruled, fought, and married on her own terms. If you think royal marriages in the Middle Ages were all about love and romance, Urraca of Leon and Castile's story will set you straight. This queen, ruling in her own right in the early 12th century, had a life so packed with drama, wars, and troublesome husbands, it could make a soap opera look tame. Urraca became Queen of Leon, Castile, and Galicia in modern-day Spain in 1109 after her father, Alfonso VI, died. He had named her his heir, which was a pretty big deal because, she was a woman. The nobles weren't too thrilled about a lone queen. They pressured her to marry, thinking a king would keep things stable. So, Urraca married Alfonso I of Aragon, also known as Alfonso the Battler. Sounds like a good match for a powerful queen, right? Wrong. So wrong. Their marriage was a disaster. Alfonso the Battler was, a battler. He wanted to control Urraca's kingdoms, not just be her husband. Urraca was having none of that. She was the queen, and she intended to rule. What followed was basically a civil war between husband and wife. Seriously. They raised armies and fought against each other. Urraca was no shrinking violet. She actively led her own forces, asserted her authority, and tried to get the marriage annulled. She accused Alfonso of mistreating her. Imagine the scandal. A queen accusing her king husband of abuse, and then going to war with him. She even allied with some of her own nobles against him. It was messy, complicated, and showed Urraca was determined to hold onto her power. But Alfonso of Aragon wasn't her only problem. Urraca also had a son from her first marriage, the future Alfonso VII. As he got older, he also became a rival for power. So Urraca found herself fighting on multiple fronts against her estranged husband, against ambitious nobles, and sometimes even navigating tricky situations with her own son and his supporters. She also had a half-sister, Teresa, Countess of Portugal, who was trying to carve out her own independent kingdom, leading to more border conflicts for Urraca. Her reign was anything but peaceful. Urraca even had a prominent lover, Count Pedro González de Lara, with whom she had children. This was, of course, scandalous, but it also shows her willingness to defy conventions. She formed political alliances through her relationships, trying to secure her position. She wasn't afraid to use all the tools available to her, even if they broke the traditional rules for queens. She managed to get her marriage to Alfonso the Battler annulled by the Pope, but that didn't stop him from meddling in her kingdoms for years. Urraca's entire reign, from 1109 to her death in 1126, was a constant struggle to maintain her authority as queen regnant, a queen ruling in her own name, not just as a wife of a king. She faced down rebellions, fought wars, and navigated incredibly complex political landscapes. She wasn't always successful, and her reign was chaotic, but Urraca fiercely defended her right to rule. She proved that a medieval queen could be just as politically astute and militarily active as any king, even if it meant making powerful enemies, including within her own family. Number 5. Tamar of Georgia, the king, who was a queen. Get this, a medieval ruler so powerful, so respected, that she was often called King Tamar, not Queen King. That was Tamar of Georgia, who reigned during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, a period often called Georgia's Golden Age. And she earned that title. Tamar became co-ruler with her father, King George III, in 1178, and then sole ruler after his death in 1184. Now, a woman ruling alone was pretty unusual, and the Georgian nobles weren't entirely sold on the idea at first. They tried to limit her power, forcing her to accept their choice for her first husband, Urraca's prince, named Yuri Bogolyubsky. It turned out to be a terrible match. Yuri was reportedly a drunkard and a brute, and Tamar, showing incredible strength, divorced him. That was a bold move for any woman back then, let alone a queen. When Yuri later tried to stage a rebellion to reclaim his position, Tamar's loyal forces crushed him twice. She wasn't messing around. Her second marriage, to David Soslan, an Alan prince, was much more successful. He was a skilled military commander and supported her rule. Together, they led Georgia into an era of unprecedented strength and cultural flourishing. Tamar wasn't just a figurehead queen. She was actively involved in governing the kingdom. She reformed the administration, supported the arts and sciences, and oversaw the construction of magnificent churches and monasteries. Many of Georgia's most famous cultural landmarks date back to her reign. But it was her military prowess that really cemented her legendary status. Under Tamar, Georgia expanded its influence and became a major power in the Caucasus region. Her armies won significant victories against neighboring Muslim states. She didn't personally lead troops into the heart of battle like some warrior queens of legend, but she was the supreme commander. She planned campaigns, appointed generals, and inspired her soldiers. Chronicles describe her addressing the army before battles, her words firing them up for victory. Imagine the sight: Queen Tamar, a powerful female ruler, commanding the loyalty and fierce fighting spirit of her troops. She was also a skilled diplomat, navigating the complex politics of the region, which included the Byzantine Empire and various Seljuk successor states. She protected Christian interests and even helped establish the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, which was ruled by her relatives. This extended Georgia's influence even further. Tamar was deeply religious and was later canonized as a saint by the Georgian Orthodox Church. This piety, combined with her strong rule and military successes, created an almost mythical image of her. She was seen as a just, wise, and divinely favored ruler. Even though she was a woman in a patriarchal world, she commanded immense authority. The title King of Kings and Queen of Queens was used for her. She didn't just defy expectations for a queen. She redefined what it meant to be a ruler in Georgia. Her reign is remembered as a time of glory and strength, all under the leadership of a woman who insisted on being recognized not just as a queen, but as a true sovereign. Number 4. Olga of Kyiv, the saint, who served revenge ice cold and fiery hot. If you ever thought saints were all about turning the other cheek, let me introduce you to Olga of Kyiv. Before she became Saint Olga, she was a 10th century princess regent of Kievan Rus, a medieval state that was a forerunner of Russia, Ukraine, and Miace. And her story of revenge is so brutal and cunning, it's legendary. It all started around 945 CE when her husband, Igor of Kyiv, went to collect tribute from a tribe called the Drevlians. He got a bit too greedy, tried to collect more than was agreed, and the Drevlians, well, they killed him. Legend says they tied him to 2 bent-down birch trees and then let the trees spring up, tearing him apart. Ouch! So Olga was left a widow with a very young son, Sviatoslav. The Drevlians, probably thinking they could now take over, sent a message to Olga proposing she marry their Prince Mal. Big mistake, huge. Olga, according to the primary chronicle, an ancient history of the region, decided to play along, but she had other plans. When the Drevlian matchmakers arrived by boat, Olga ordered her men to carry them in their boat into her courtyard, and then had them thrown into a deep trench that she'd had dug the night before. Then she had them buried alive. Yes, buried alive. She even supposedly leaned over the pit and asked if they found the honor to their taste chilling. But Olga wasn't done. Not by a long shot. She then sent a message to the Drevlians, saying she accepted the proposal, but needed their most distinguished men to escort her. When this second Drevlian delegation arrived, Olga invited them to wash up in a bathhouse after their journey. Once they were all inside, she had the doors locked and the bathhouse set on fire. Everyone inside burned to death. Still not satisfied, Olga then told the Drevlians she was coming to their capital, Iskorostan, to hold a funeral feast for her dead husband. She told them to prepare a lot of mead. The Drevlians, somehow still not realizing who they were dealing with, or maybe too scared to refuse, did as she asked. Olga and her small retinue arrived, mourned Igor, and then her men started serving the Drevlians vast amounts of mead. When the Drevlians were completely drunk and passed out, Olga ordered her soldiers to slaughter them. The chronicle claims 5,000 Drevlians were killed that day. The final act of revenge was the siege of Iskorostan. The city held out for a year. Then Olga supposedly sent a message saying she would forgive them if they just gave her a small tribute. 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house. The Drevlians, overjoyed at such a light demand, quickly complied. What they didn't know was Olga's plan. She had her soldiers tie a piece of smoldering sulfur-bound cloth to each bird's leg. Then they released the birds. The pigeons and sparrows flew back to their nests in the houses, barns, and haylofts of Iskorostan, setting the entire city ablaze. As people fled the burning city, Olga's soldiers captured or killed them. After all this, Olga ruled as regent for her son for many years. Later in life, she converted to Christianity, becoming one of the first Rus rulers to do so, and she worked to spread the faith. For this, she was eventually made a saint. But it's her elaborate, ruthless, and terrifyingly clever revenge that really makes her stand out as a medieval woman who was definitely not to be messed with. She didn't just break rules. She rewrote the playbook on vengeance. Number 3. Empress Matilda, the queen, who fought a war for her crown and almost won. Imagine being declared the heir to the English throne by your father, the king. All the important nobles swear an oath to support you. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? Well, not if you're a woman in the 12th century and your name is Empress Matilda. Her fight for the crown plunged England into a long and bitter civil war known as the Anarchy. Matilda was the daughter of King Henry I of England. Her brother, William Adelin, the original heir, tragically drowned, leaving Matilda as Henry's only legitimate child. Henry I made his barons swear multiple times that they would accept Matilda as queen after his death. She even had an impressive title already, Empress, from her first marriage to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor. After he died, she returned to England, a powerful and experienced woman. But when King Henry I died, In 1135, things went sideways fast. Many English nobles just weren't ready for a queen regnant. Plus, Matilda had a reputation for being a bit proud and haughty. Maybe being an empress does that to you. So her cousin Stephen of Blois swooped in, crossed the Channel, and got himself crowned King of England. He argued that he was a man, that he was nearby, and that the kingdom needed a strong male ruler. Many barons, conveniently forgetting their oaths to Matilda, supported him. Matilda was not amused, and she was definitely not going to let this go. Supported by her powerful half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, and her second husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, Matilda launched her bid to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. This kicked off nearly 2 decades of war. England was torn apart as Matilda's forces, the Angevins, or Empress's party, battled Stephen's. Castles were besieged, lands were ravaged, and allegiances shifted like sand. Matilda herself was a key player. She landed in England in 1139 to press her claim in person. She showed remarkable resilience and determination. There were dramatic escapes, like when she was besieged in Oxford Castle in the dead of winter and supposedly escaped by dressing in white and sneaking across the frozen River Thames through enemy lines. Talk about nerve. In 1141, it looked like Matilda was finally going to win. Her forces captured King Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln. Huge victory. Matilda triumphantly entered London and began preparations to be crowned queen. She was proclaimed Lady of the English. But then things fell apart. Remember that reputation for being proud. It came back to bite her. She apparently alienated the Londoners with her demands and high-handed attitude. And Stephen's wife, also named Matilda, confusing right, rallied support for her captive husband. The Londoners revolted and drove Empress Matilda out of the city before she could be officially crowned. So close, yet so far. Soon after, her key supporter, Robert of Gloucester, was captured, and Matilda had to agree to exchange King Stephen for him. The war dragged on. Matilda continued to fight for her cause for several more years in England, but she never quite regained the upper hand she'd had in 1141. Eventually, she returned to Normandy, which her husband Geoffrey had conquered. Though Matilda herself never wore the English crown, she didn't entirely lose. Her persistence paid off in a way. After years of fighting, a compromise was reached. Stephen would remain king, but Matilda's son, Henry, would be his heir. And so when Stephen died in 1154, Matilda's son became King Henry II, the first of the powerful Plantagenet kings. Matilda had fought tooth and nail, defied expectations of how a woman should behave, and even though she didn't get the crown herself, she ensured her son did. She showed that a woman could indeed fight for a throne with as much tenacity as any man. Number 2. Isabella of France, the she-wolf, who brought down a king. Isabella of France earned the nickname, the she-wolf of France. And let me tell you, it wasn't for her gentle nature. This queen consort of England took on her own husband, King Edward II, and didn't just challenge him, she overthrew him. This is a story of royal discontent, forbidden love, and a queen who decided enough was enough. Isabella, daughter of the powerful French king Philip IV, married Edward II of England in 1308. It was supposed to be a strategic alliance, standard royal stuff. But Edward II had a problem, at least in the eyes of Isabella and many English nobles. He was overly fond of his male favorite, first Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despencer. These men were showered with titles, lands, and power, alienating the king from his wife and the rest of the nobility. Isabella, a beautiful and intelligent woman from a proud royal lineage, found herself ignored and humiliated. Her husband seemed to prefer the company of these men to hers, and they actively worked to undermine her influence. For years, Isabella endured it. She bore Edward 4 children, including the future Edward III. She tried to play the loyal wife, but things got worse and worse. The Despensers became incredibly powerful and greedy, and Edward II let them do pretty much whatever they wanted. Isabella felt increasingly marginalized and even threatened. Her chance to act came in 1325. She was sent to France, her homeland, to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, King Charles IV of France, regarding a dispute over Gascony, an English territory in France. Once in France, Isabella made it clear she wasn't coming back to England as long as the Despensers were in power. And here's where things get really juicy. In Paris, she publicly began an affair with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English nobleman who was a bitter enemy of Edward II and the Despensers. Talk about a scandal! The Queen of England openly taking a lover and plotting against her husband. Together, Isabella and Mortimer became the ultimate power couple with a mission. They gathered a small army of mercenaries, and in September 1326, they invaded England. You read that right? The Queen and her lover invaded her husband's kingdom. Many English nobles, fed up with Edward II and the Despensers, flocked to their banner. Their campaign was surprisingly swift and successful. The Despensers were captured and brutally executed. Hugh Despencer the Younger was reportedly hanged, drawn, and quartered. King Edward II fled, but was eventually captured. With Edward II a prisoner, Isabella and Mortimer were in charge. In January 1327, Parliament was persuaded to depose Edward II, formally ending his reign. His young son was crowned King Edward III, but since he was only 14, Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents in his name. What happened to Edward II? He died in Berkeley Castle a few months later, under very suspicious circumstances. Many believe he was murdered on the orders of Isabella and Mortimer to prevent any chance of his return to power. The exact manner of his death is a gruesome legend, though historians debate its truth. For about 3 years, Isabella and Mortimer held the reins of England. Isabella, the once sidelined queen, was now at the pinnacle of power. She had defied her king, taken a lover, led an invasion, and effectively seized control of the country. However, their rule became increasingly unpopular. Mortimer, in particular, was seen as arrogant and greedy, much like the Despensers before him. In 1330, the young King Edward III, now 17, decided he'd had enough of being a puppet king. In a daring nighttime raid on Nottingham Castle, he had Mortimer arrested. Mortimer was swiftly tried and executed for treason. Isabella's power was broken. Edward III spared his mother's life, but she was forced into a comfortable but powerless retirement. Isabella of France's story is a stark reminder that medieval queens weren't always passive figures. She took extreme measures, broke all the rules, and for a time she triumphed, earning her formidable nickname for all time. Number 1. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen who lived a dozen lifetimes in one. If there's one medieval queen who truly smashed expectations and wrote her own rules, it's Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her life was so long, so eventful, and so influential that it's hard to believe it all happened to one person. She was queen of 2 different major kingdoms, went on a crusade, was a massive patron of the arts, rebelled against her own husband, was imprisoned for years and lived to see her sons become kings. Buckle up. Eleanor inherited the vast and wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine in southwestern France in 1137, when she was just a teenager. This made her the most eligible bachelorette in Europe. Seriously. Aquitaine was huge and rich. She almost immediately married Louis VII, the heir to the French throne, who became king just a few weeks later. So, boom, she's Queen of France. But Eleanor wasn't content to just be a queen in Paris. Aquitaine was hers, and she remained its duchess. She even accompanied Louis VII on the Second Crusade to the Holy Land. This was highly unusual for a queen. There were scandalous rumors about her behavior on crusade, including whispers of an affair with her uncle Raymond of Antioch. Whether true or not, it shows she wasn't fitting the mold of a demure queen. The crusade was a military disaster, and her marriage to Louis, which was already strained, they didn't have any sons, a big problem for a king, deteriorated further. Eleanor famously complained that she had married a monk, not a king. So, what did she do? She got an annulment in 1152 on the grounds of consanguinity. They were too closely related, a common excuse for royals wanting a divorce. And just a few weeks later, literally weeks, she married Henry, Duke of Normandy, who was 11 years younger than her and, crucially, soon to be King Henry II of England. This was a massive power move. By marrying Henry, she brought Aquitaine into his already considerable French territories, creating a vast Angevin empire that rivaled and even surpassed the power of the French king, her ex-husband. Eleanor and Henry II had a stormy relationship, but also a productive one. They had 8 children, including future kings Richard the Lionheart and John. Yes, that King John of Magna Carta fame. Eleanor was deeply involved in the politics of their empire, often ruling in Aquitaine or acting as regent in England when Henry was away. She was a huge patron of the arts, and her court was a center of troubadour poetry and chivalric culture. But as her sons grew older, tensions rose with Henry II. Eleanor, always fiercely protective of her own rights and those of her children, supported her sons when they rebelled against their father in 1173 to 1174. This was a direct challenge to Henry's authority, led or at least encouraged by his own wife. The rebellion failed, and Henry II was not forgiving. He had Eleanor imprisoned for 16 years. 16. Imagine this vibrant, powerful woman locked away. But you can't keep Eleanor down forever. When Henry II died in 1189, their son Richard the Lionheart became king and immediately freed his mother. And Eleanor, then in her late 60s, an old age for the time, jumped right back into the political arena. She ruled as regent while Richard was off on the Third Crusade. She skillfully managed England, raised his ransom when he was captured in Austria, and secured his throne against the plots of her own younger son, John. Even after Richard died and John became king, Eleanor continued to be a political force. She undertook diplomatic missions, arranged marriages, and worked to protect her beloved Aquitaine. She was still traveling and making power plays well into her 70s and even 80s. She outlived most of her children and died in 1204, around the age of 82, at the Abbey of Fontefraud, where she is buried between her husband, Henry II, and her son, Richard the Lionheart. Eleanor of Aquitaine's life was a master class in defying expectations. She wielded immense power, challenged kings, including two she was married to, survived imprisonment, and left an indelible mark on the political and cultural landscape of Europe. She wasn't just a queen. She was a phenomenon